So the Gray Zone recently published your article on Western regime change operatives launching the campaign to blame President Evo Morales for the Amazon fires. This seems like a real coordinated operation. Where is this claim rooted, which places the blame on Bolivia and President Evo Morales for the fires?
Well, this claim is rooted, as these claims often are, with a mainstream media in the West, which is constantly on the lookout for ways to demonize any government which is perceived as standing against the interests of the imperial core, in this case, the United States, Europe. So specifically, we can trace the origins of this particular story back to a lot of mainstream media outlets, New York Times, The Guardian, Fox News, CBC, plenty of these outlets which, described Jair Bolsonaro's ascendancy to power as a boon to investors in the West are, now suddenly very concerned with the potential ecological impacts of governments in South America. And also to a handful of individuals, most notably a woman named Janice Bacadasa, who is the director of this NGO in Bolivia named Rios de Pie. She is essentially at the head of what is now appearing more and more to be a full-on regime change operation targeted at the progressive government of Evo Morales in Bolivia. And she is essentially trained by the Harvard Kennedy School, which is widely known as a training ground for CIA officers mid-career will go enroll in this particular program. And she heads up a fellowship program for the Human Rights Foundation, which is this massive sort of libertarian NGO supposedly aimed at introducing human rights to poor oppressed peoples all over the world. In practice, this looks like supposed anti-authoritarian campaigns in any government that opposes the interests of the West.
You say that there is this anti-Evo Morales campaign which has been orchestrated by, you said, Janice Vacadaza. She's an anti-Morales operative identified as an environmental activist. I have to say this looks a lot like what we've seen in Nicaragua as well. Seems like these operatives take the same form just about anywhere you find a leftist government, even using the hashtag SOS Bolivia again. What more can you tell us about her, and where do they find people like this to do the work?
Well, sometimes they find them, other times they don't necessarily need to find them at all. The reality is that sort of the nature of the nonprofit industrial complex calls to these sort of careerists who look to nonprofit work as a way to generate their own sort of future prospects, and especially when it comes to demonizing countries that the West seeks to overthrow. They are never obviously jeopardizing their futures in the way that environmental activists, for example, many of my friends who are deeply embedded in this fight against, for example, pipelines here in the U.S., these are the kind of people who, in locking down to some particular piece of equipment, will end up facing felony terrorism charges. These are the kind of environmental activists who I am aware of that are doing sort of the hard work, but you don't find these kind of people in these sort of polished narratives that pop up in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, in Bolivia, especially in Hong Kong as well. The types of activists who we end up seeing rewarded in these movements are people like this Hong Kong leader who was just granted a full scholarship to go to Yale for his participation in what many have characterized as riots. So the answer is these people really sort of like moths to a lamp. They can't sort of help themselves but be attracted to these astroturf movements against progressive governments.
What are some of the interests behind this destabilization in that case?
Well, the interests behind this destabilization campaign are the usual suspects, the CIA, and then their cutouts, their supposedly non-governmental cutouts, essentially the forms in which they utilize soft power to overthrow government. So that includes the National Endowment for Democracy, USAID. These are the same culprits that you'll find in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and now in Bolivia as well, essentially attempting to build up their own parallel power structure that they can utilize to either call for mass mobilizations against the sitting president, or they can use to, as we saw recently in Santa Cruz in Bolivia, actually go out and trash the town, have these massive violent protests, burn down a public health center, basically do whatever they can to jeopardize the electoral prospects of any leftist government that threatens to outstay its welcome.
Now, we're seeing these liberal manifestations of environmentalism now. I actually saw that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau met with Greta Thunberg and then joined the climate march that I believe took place in Montreal, Quebec, Canada. Is Trudeau not the guy we're supposed to be protesting against for his foul record on Indigenous rights and pipelines? What's your take on that?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting that Justin Trudeau managed to find time to remove the blackface from his face for not just one meet and greet with Greta Thunberg, but to actually go out and lead this climate strike march ostensibly aimed at the sources of power in their society, which is what makes it that much more comical that we are sort of looking towards people who seem to not really know where to lead us, or lead us right back into the same sort of problem. And this, when we look at Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg and sort of these larger NGO-backed climate movements, what we find, especially in terms of the messaging, a lot of this messaging about sort of the house is on fire, we must act now. This all dates back to a 2016 paper by the Climate Mobilization, which is on its board of directors are people like Avaz, 350.org, Greenpeace leaders, and then Jamila Rakib, who was sort of the right-hand woman of Gene Sharp, the godfather of regime change, as many have labeled him, who sort of originated many of these tactics that Janice Vakadasa is now carrying out, and Extinction Rebellion specifically as well, as in their ideology on their websites worldwide, they cite this book by a woman named Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stefan. They both work extremely closely with the State Department. These are women who, this theory that 3.5% of a population is all that's required to generate a change in a society, that is a theory that is sourced from the State Department or their open collaborators. So it really brings us to the question of who is leading these strikes and where are they trying to take us?